Get some quarterbacks to come to the shoe. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Buckeyes. We've got Steve Hellwagon on the line from Bucknuts. It's 247 Sports platform for Ohio State athletics. Of course, lock it in right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, for the very best in discussion, debate, and analysis from the best in bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry. You can support the channel by grabbing the Amazon link below and doing your Amazon shopping using that link. Doesn't cost you a penny. Just use the link and help build the channel. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mark. What's going on?
Ohio State's lost a couple quarterbacks. That's been the focus of our conversations for the last few months, and now they've got one coming in from Kentucky. I am very familiar with the name because he was fairly highly thought of coming out of high school, went to Kentucky, was expected to win the job there. Never happened. Didn't end up throwing his first passes in Lexington until this past fall, and they were basically in mop-up duty. So we got Gunnar Hoak coming to Ohio State, a native Ohioan.
Yeah, his dad was a walk-on at Ohio State. His uncle, Fred Puggich, was a longtime assistant coach and a former player there. His cousin, Fred Puggich Jr., was a player for the Buckeyes in the early 2000s as well. So there are some family ties. He's said that he was born at Ohio State University Medical Center, which is just a few hundred yards from the stadium. And, of course, from Dublin Kaufman High School, a school that sent a number of guys to Ohio State in the past, including Jake Stoneburner, Mike Adams in particular, guys from Dublin Kaufman who signed to play at Ohio State. And so Gunnar Hoak, as you mentioned, went to Kentucky, redshirted a year, did not play as a redshirt freshman. And then as a third-year sophomore this past year, he got into a few games. He was battling last spring for the starting job. I believe the other player's name was Wilson, who ended up being their starter, I guess, at Kentucky. And there were some instances in the season where Hoak actually got in there and got to play. There was a game early in the year against Central Michigan where he came in and threw 4 for 5 for 50 yards and had the go-ahead touchdown. I think they may have trailed at halftime and came back, and he kind of helped spark the comeback. But in the game at Missouri, a historic game, I think a lot of people remember, with Kentucky making that great, furious comeback at the end to win it. He got a chance to play. Danny Clark got a chance to play, and Wilson as well. And ultimately, it was Wilson who led the team on the comeback victory. And that kind of solidified things in terms of him as the starter the rest of the season. So Hoak was relegated to the bench. And as I understand it, talking to people at Kentucky, when Matthew Baldwin's name went into the transfer portal for Ohio State, the Buckeyes were kind of left exposed a little bit with a lack of depth at the quarterback position. It was at that moment when Hoak decided he wanted to put his name into the transfer portal for the express purpose of transferring to Ohio State. Had this opportunity not arisen, it's possible, I suppose, he'd still be at Kentucky. But the good thing from Ohio State's standpoint is twofold. One, he's going to graduate from the University of Kentucky in 3 years, which is phenomenal for him, and make him eligible at Ohio State immediately. And the other thing is he's got 2 full years of eligibility left. So he can be quite a bridge for Fields and for Justin Fields to be his backup this coming season and perhaps the following year. But obviously Ohio State's got a quarterback recruit coming in 2020 in Jack Miller, one of the nation's top quarterbacks out of Arizona. So really this is the year they needed somebody to bridge that gap and provide depth. They have Chris Chuganoff, the former West Virginia quarterback, in there as well. He'll be a senior. He was a grad transfer last year, kind of the same scenario as Hoak. So now they've got Fields, and then you've got Hoak and Chuganoff behind him, and you'll have a couple of walk-ons as well. They added a walk-on this week, J.P. Andrade, who threw for over 4,000 yards at a high school in California. And he had some small school offers. I think South Alabama, maybe a couple 1AA or FCS schools had offered him, but he did not sign this past winter, and now he too will be coming to Ohio State in 2019. So they've they've kind of put a Band-Aid on the situation, for lack of a better term, by bringing in a few more guys. And I think it's going to be up to Coach Ryan Day and Mike Yursich, the quarterback's coach and the offensive coordinator, to kind of to get these guys all indoctrinated this summer and see if any of them will be in a position to help the team this fall when something would happen to Fields.
Yeah, these are not necessarily the recruiting rankings for individual players that we're used to talking about when it comes to Ohio State football, with Andrade at the 57th rated pro style quarterback coming out of, as you mentioned, Laverne, California in 2019, the 185th rated player in the state of California, 1,729. I don't even know how they count that high and can separate players at that point. So he's going to get some snaps with Ohio State and try to fill in a backup role. And then we mentioned, of course, and outline Gunnar Hoak's situation in Kentucky. He was the 37th rated player in the state of Ohio coming out of high school, number 40 rated pro style quarterback. Kentucky, I believe, if I remember this correctly, going into last season, was the only school in the Power Five that did not have a quarterback on the roster that had taken a snap from center, not just had not thrown a pass, but taken a snap from center in major college football. And so Hoak was expected to compete heavily for the job. He did, but Terry Wilson did end up to be the quarterback. And even though the Wildcats offense was far less than prolific, nothing close to what Dwayne Haskins and company produced at Ohio State, they relied on defense, had their best season in 40 years and finished 10-3. But Terry Wilson basically looked for one receiver and tucked and ran, and that was his deal at Kentucky. So Gunnar Hoak looks for the opportunity to follow his lineage and go back to Ohio State and fill out a backup role. Got Steve Hellwagen on the line from Bucknuts, 247 Sports Platform for Ohio State football. Of course, you checked in here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We have the best discussion, debate, and analysis on a daily basis of college football. So we'll keep it in the same category, Steve. Young quarterbacks. Kyle McCord, 2021, 8th rated pro style quarterback coming out of Philadelphia, is committed to Ohio State. Now, I find it interesting that they can even rate these kids after a sophomore season. He's got 2 more full seasons to play, his 2 most important years in high school football, but they've seen enough there in Columbus to try to reel him in.
Yeah, I think he's ranked right outside the top 100 in that 2021 class. As you mentioned, one of the top 10 pro-style quarterbacks in the country. And they had him and also his star receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr., came in from their school in Philadelphia for Ohio State's spring game, and very impressed both of them were. Ohio State offered him a scholarship, and it is very early in the process, obviously, for a high school sophomore to know where he wants to go, particularly going out of state at this early stage of the process. He can't sign anywhere until December of 2020, which is still probably 20 months away in that realm, so 19, 20 months. So it'll be a while until he gets to campus. But as we mentioned earlier, they got Jack Miller coming from Arizona in 2020. He's considered one of the top quarterbacks in that class. And now you're adding McCord. His team at Philadelphia, I think it was Philadelphia Catholic, blanking on the name of his school.
St. Joseph's.
Philadelphia St. Joseph's. Thank you. And they went 13-0, and they ended up ranked 11th in the country in max preps. And he had an outstanding sophomore season. And he has really put himself in position to be considered one of the nation's top quarterbacks. I think he's in the 6'3", 215, 210-pound range, something like that. So he's got the look and everything that you're hoping to get. As we mentioned, he and Marvin Harrison Jr. were both max prep sophomore All-American first-team picks. So they look at some of the guys for that in terms of recruiting and offers and weight and size and all the stuff that goes into the recruiting rankings. But it's also primarily based on how you performed on the field. So that's good to know that within his sophomore class, he was considered one of the top players, one of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks only a year. I don't know if he played much as a freshman or not, but certainly his best football will be ahead of him the next 2 years, throwing to Marvin Harrison if they're able to keep that tandem together. And I know that Harrison in particular and his dad very impressed with Ohio State, and it would not shock me one bit if he follows suit and picks Ohio State down the line. Ohio State and Penn State, that has been kind of the primary rivalry in the Eastern Division since they reshuffled the deck here a few years ago. And for Ohio State to go in there and take the best quarterback in the 2021 class out of Pennsylvania, a kid that Penn State definitely wanted, that is a tremendous coup, certainly for Ryan Day. And what Ohio State needs to do is to out-recruit its rivals within the division, Penn State, Michigan State, on a consistent basis to continue its dominance. Ever since they've switched to the East-West formation, Ohio State's won every division championship or tied for it. So they're right where they want to be and want to stay there. And again, you go from a situation of uncertainty. You lose Martell, you lose Baldwin, you bring in Fields. And as we said, for lack of a better term, these stopgap guys that they're throwing in here with Hoak and the walk-on Andrade and all the different kind of Band-Aids they put on the situation. But the most important thing is the stability long-term. And it looks good in that regard that Miller would come in, probably sit behind Fields. And if Fields leaves after 3 years for the NFL, then it would be Miller and McCord that would be in position in 2021 to kind of take over that reign. So, again, very transient, the nature of this quarterback position and the portal and the ability to simply click on a website, put your name out there, and anybody in the country can now contact you, has really streamlined this process to where guys can be gone in a blink of an eye. So I think that Ohio State has responded very well to this predicament they were put in.
Yeah, and it gives us something to talk about in the middle of May, I guess. That would be one of the advantages for those of us who cover it, or the burden of those of us, namely you, who cover it and have to keep up with items like that when you're not expected to, and haven't had to keep track of Ohio State football quite as closely in the middle of May as you do now, unless somebody would get in trouble or get hurt. That's been basically the news from the end of spring camp to August, has been people getting hurt and people getting in trouble. But with this transfer portal, guys are moving and shifting, and it's continuing. I thought we saw it dry up a little bit over the last month, but it seems to continue with guys seeing opportunities elsewhere. And you would think that conventional wisdom would be that Ohio State is going to alter its offensive play calling, maybe not the offense itself, but the play calling, with Justin Fields being alone as a highly touted quarterback, that they may limit his running, I would think.
Yeah, what we saw with J.T. Barrett was if it was an undermanned opponent, a team that they could beat without having to put him in harm's way, that they would not call runs for him. If he scrambled out of the pocket and was left to try and get something on his own, then so be it. But they really limited in the not so big games his exposure, which only makes sense. Then you would get into a tougher game, a Penn State, a Michigan, and it would not be uncommon to see him run the ball 15 or 20 times. And on one hand, this is something that you really haven't showed people a lot of in some of your non-competitive games. So in some ways, it's kind of a surprise weapon. Although I'm sure all these teams know and understand that Fields is a dynamic runner. So I think it'll be the same situation. Use him very prudently in that regard, and don't put him in harm's way, because the season really does kind of hang on what he will do, because as much of an unknown as he is, certainly much bigger question marks if this falls to Chugginoff or to Gunnar Hoak to try and take this team over in mid-season if something were to happen to Fields. And people have asked me, I saw something about the 2020 NFL draft and said that there was, Ohio State had 9 guys drafted this year. What would be the over under for next year? And I started counting it up, and I got into double digits pretty easily. And I see Chase Young is already mentioned in some regards as a candidate for number 1 overall or top 10 or whatever for next year. So they have got the window for them to contend for a national championship is this season, in my opinion, even though you're on the road at Michigan, which is going to be a tough place to play. Certainly this year, 2019, seems to be Ohio State's best chance to win a national championship here for the foreseeable future, just because the amount of talent that will be surrounding Fields, both offensively and defensively. So I think that they need to make the most of this, and keeping him healthy is probably the best way that they could do that.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Dig into the video library that you see, over 7,000 videos. And as you will find out, we cover college football like few others. For example, 32 team reports during spring camp. And for most of those teams, like Ohio State, multiple reports, thanks to the likes of Steve Hellwagen from 247 Sports Bucknuts. And so lock it in here, subscribe, like, comment, and share the videos as well. All right, everybody, play along here. I'm going to toss out a few questions for Steve, some off-season fun while we wait through the warmer days. Hopefully they're coming here in May. And this is a tough one. This is a difficult one. So I'm going to label it as most exhilarating wins. So there doesn't necessarily have to be a qualifier that won a championship or it was a Michigan game, but just most, whether that's personal to you or based on your interactions with fans, most exhilarating win, or you can certainly, with as long as you've been covering Ohio State football, we'll let you go for a list of 3, 5, 10, however long you want to go on the best wins in the history of the program.
Well, I'm 51, so I got to throw in there that I've been following it really closely since about the mid-'70s, and covered it part-time from the late 80s until 94, and then full-time since 95. So this will be, I guess, my 25th year full-time covering the team. If you want to just confine it to those 25 years, which have really been an amazing glory stretch for Ohio State, taking in some of John Cooper's better teams at the end of the 90s. I mean, his 95, 96, 98 teams were all right there in the top 5 most of the year. And 96, 98, they finished second. And then up through Jim Tressel, 7 Big Ten championships in 10 years for him, national championship in 2002, and then on to Urban Meyer, what he was able to do in his tenure with the championship in 14. I think the number one win, if I had to say, if we just confined it to that 25 years, would probably be the win over Miami in the 2003 Fiesta Bowl to win the national championship. That was in the BCS format where it was just 1 versus 2. They were I believe, the only 2 unbeaten teams left at the end of the season. And everybody thought Miami was going to smash Ohio State, but Ohio State snapped a string, I want to say, of 35 years without a true national championship, in winning that game. And it was a thrilling game, double overtime. Craig Krenzel, Maurice Clarett, Mike Doss, those were all the heroes in that game. Michael Jenkins as well played a big role, and Chris Gamble, of course, too. So offense and defense, amazingly. So I would put that at the top of the list, just because it was the first national championship that I recall in my lifetime. Obviously, they won it the year I was born in 1968, but I would not have remembered anything about that. I think for 2 generations of Ohio State fans, it was their first championship win. I would say number 2 is Alabama in the college football playoff semifinals. Again, everybody picked Alabama. I could sit here and talk to you for 2 weeks about the lead up to that game. And one of the great anecdotes was Paul Feinbaum was on the radio. And of course, he's a big Alabama guy. And, he's maintaining Alabama's, before the playoff, is the clear team that's going to win the national championship. And, well, Florida State, they've got this. And he says, oh, they don't have much of a chance. And they've got that. Well, they don't have much of a chance. It's Alabama all the way. And then they asked him about Ohio State, and he said they have no chance. It basically was what he said. And, he had Marty Smith on his radio show, and Marty said, now, Paul, don't be surprised if the Buckeyes pull this off. It was the morning of the game, like 7 a.m. He was on the radio with him. And Paul said, well, I mean, that's what you think. I don't see it, but, whatever. And Ohio State did it. Ezekiel Elliott had the big run, and Cardale Jones, just a second career start. They fell behind 2 touchdowns in that game. And to me, that is probably right there with the Miami game. The Oregon game was almost an anticlimax, really. There was not anything much dramatic about it. Ohio State, I think Oregon scored early, but Ohio State jumped on them pretty good and had the thing on lockdown much of the way in the second half, as I recall. So, I think if I had to go beyond those first 2, I would say Michigan in 2002, because that put them in the national championship game. It was a dramatic win, 14-9. And the stadium at Ohio State, they had lowered the playing field to increase the seating. Basically, they got rid of the running track, lowered the field, and put seats down as close as they could to the field to add more seating. But there was still about a 6-foot drop, 8-foot drop from the first row. And when they had wrapped up that game, I think Will Allen intercepted a pass on the last play. The people came spilling over that barrier like it was a 1-foot barrier, and it was a 6 or 8-foot drop. And they all met each other in the middle of the field like this, and they came from every direction as fast as they possibly could. It was probably the biggest field storm I've ever witnessed in person, just spontaneous. I mean, just from every direction. And it was a breakthrough because, referenced this a moment ago, Cooper, 95, had one of the great teams that Ohio State's ever had, and they lose at Michigan. 96, they're undefeated, lose at Michigan. 98, undefeated, they lose to Michigan State. So this was 4 or 5 years later, 2002. These people are starved for a championship, and it obviously clinches the Big Ten and puts them in the Fiesta Bowl. There was a formula in place where they were supposed to have these rankings or whatever, but everybody knew that when Ohio State got to the finish line undefeated, they were going to be in the top 2, and the Fiesta Bowl people were on hand to make that presentation and say, you're going, to the Fiesta Bowl. Now, if by some miracle somebody had outpointed them, I don't know what they would have done, but at any rate, it wasn't going to happen. They were undefeated. So, and people derided that team as one of the worst national championship teams too of the BCS and playoff era, but they were 14-0. They won a lot of close games, and certainly I'd put that game, Michigan in 06 was 1-2, was an amazing win for Ohio State, but it didn't lead to anything because they went out and got stomped by Florida in the very next game. In 2016, it was kind of the same situation. I think it was 2-3, and Ohio State won the game in I guess double overtime. They won that game, and they didn't get to go to the Big Ten championship that year because they had lost to Penn State. Penn State got to go, but Ohio State got to go to the playoff. And again, the huge win didn't amount to anything because they got stomped by Clemson in the playoffs. So, yeah, it's just I would say those 4 or 5 probably stand out. I know there's got to be others through the years. The win at Oklahoma was pretty amazing. I don't know. Those are probably some of the bigger ones that I can recall. Urban Meyer was asked at the celebrity golf outing this past week that he played at, what was his biggest win in his time at Ohio State, and he said his last one over Michigan was big, just because the respect they had for Michigan, and to put 62 points on the board against Michigan, a record 62-39, they won the game, and so that's his favorite, I suppose, and probably will be for a lot of people for years to come. But that's probably my list of the 4 or 5.
My defense for that 2002 team that you mentioned, and I've heard the same thing, that it was one of the worst national championship teams. They certainly played what was considered to be one of the greatest teams of all time, number one. So they didn't play what would be a more middling or marginal championship type team. So they played one of the great and most NFL stocked teams that we've ever seen in regards to first round draft picks and overall draft picks. Also, if you look at Ohio State's talent level on that team and look to see what those players did in the pros, they certainly were not void of talent themselves. They were loaded with all sorts of exceptional NFL players. I think the entire defense was drafted, and you had, even though they were not considered a prolific, nor were they a prolific passing team, they still had Chris Gamble and Michael Jenkins, who were very productive receivers. Well, Gamble, a defensive back in the NFL, but Jenkins, a very productive receiver with the Falcons, and a number of tight ends that went to the NFL. They were loaded with the NFL draft selections themselves, and the Big Ten was a very, very good league that year with Michigan, Penn State, Wisconsin, and some other teams involved. Iowa,
Iowa
shared the championship.
Iowa was undefeated in the Big Ten as well. They didn't play each other. There was no championship game back then, and Iowa was squawking about, I think they had a loss, maybe Iowa State or something early in the year, and they were squawking about how they should be in the championship game or whatever, and they got annihilated by USC in the Orange Bowl, I guess. And the funny story is, a buddy of mine, after Ohio State had won the game at Tempe in Miami, and all the Ohio State people are celebrating. They went in, he was in the men's room, and it got quiet in there, and everybody was yipping and yelling about Ohio State. And somebody just out of the blue said, we wouldn't have beaten Iowa. And it got a big uproar of applause or laughter there in the post-game celebration. So, yeah, it was fun times, no question. And you mentioned it. I mean, they scraped by Wisconsin. They scraped by Penn State. Had to go to overtime to beat Illinois. Had the Holy Buckeye play the touchdown from Krenzel to Jenkins to beat Purdue on the road. And early in the season, they played the University of Cincinnati down at Paul Brown Stadium where the Bengals play. It was a special kind of one-off type situation to get they had a contract for maybe 3 games in Columbus and 1 game in Cincinnati at the NFL stadium. And they pulled that one out like 23-19 as well. So they beat Washington State, who was number 8 in the country, with Jason Gesser early in the season. So that was another feather in their cap. And again, just a ton of memorable games. And again, that team was probably 11 or 12 in the preseason. They had gone, I believe, 7-5 the year before in Jim Tressel's first season, and had lost. They beat Michigan, but then they lost to South Carolina in the Outback Bowl. And they had a lot of guys coming back, obviously. And as you mentioned, a lot of guys off that team did play a number of years in the NFL and were longtime NFL players, like the late Will Smith, who passed away, was killed in a traffic incident here a few years ago in New Orleans. And he was an NFL guy for a number of years with the Saints. Mike Doss, his career was cut short a little bit by injury. But yeah, offensive and defensive lines were both very productive. And Ben Hartsock was the tight end, and he played a number of years in the NFL. Craig Krenzel banged around the NFL with the Bears and the Bengals for about 3 or 4 years. So yeah, they had a lot of talent and a great coaching staff. You talk about Mark D'Antonio was the defensive coordinator on that staff, and just everybody that the late Joe Daniels was the quarterback's coach. He had just a tremendous staff around him.
what was really odd about the schedule that season, and you know this better than I do, Steve, is that we were coming through an era of college football in which everybody was playing 11-game seasons until very recently. And you mentioned the 7-5 season, which was, of course, a 7-4 regular season. So only an 11-game season, lost to South Carolina 31-28 at the Outback Bowl, a game in which they came back from 28-0 down to tie 28 all. And then Belisari threw an interception that led to the game winning field goal for the Gamecocks. But after an 11-game season, regular season in 2001, they play a 14-game regular, or I'm
13
sorry,
game,
13-game
game.
regular season. So they played 2 more games, and
Yeah.
they played them all consecutively. I don't know that anybody's ever done that in the history of college football and win all of them. 13
Yeah,
straight weeks.
it was a situation, I think, in the late 90s where the athletic directors and the conference commissioners got together and decided that in certain years where there were X number of Saturdays between September 1st or Labor Day weekend and Thanksgiving, that they would squeeze in an extra game. If there was still room to have a bye week and play 12 games, they were going to do it because they wanted the revenue and the money. And 2002 was a year where they did that, and 2003 was a year where they did that. Then I want to say in 2004 it was a regular. It went back to 11. 2005 it went back to 11, and finally in 2006 it became permanent. I believe the 12-game regular season became permanent. Yep. And they've played 12 games ever since then. 2002 was one of the last years where they still had probably the Kickoff Classic and the Pigskin Classic. And one of the trade-offs that they ultimately made by going to 12 games permanently was to say, okay, no more of these preseason classics. The only kind of waiver they give you now is if you're playing, I want to say at Hawaii, maybe you get to have an extra game back in the United States as a 13th game to help defray the costs of having to fly to Hawaii. So right now, everyone's pretty much locked in at 12-game regular season. So Ohio State that year played Texas Tech in the Pigskin, or was it the Pigskin Classic or the it had to be, I think it was the Pigskin Classic, which was a kind of a rotating game that it was played sometimes at neutral fields, but also sometimes at a school's stadium. So they played Texas Tech. I want to say Cliff Kingsbury was the quarterback for Texas Tech in that game. And now, of course, he's the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. And that was Maurice Claret's debut. He rushed for over 200 yards as a freshman in his debut in that game. And I want to say it was played on August the 24th, something like that. And then the season kicked off in earnest a week or two later. They played their 12-game regular season, and then, obviously got the 14th game when they went to the Fiesta Bowl, and were the first 14-0 team in the 1A ranks. So I think we just had a 15-0 team maybe last year or this year, finally, to kind of take that mantle now as the winningest single season team with either Clemson or Alabama. I think maybe both. I think Alabama last year and maybe Clemson this year were both 15-0, I believe. But it was historic, and yeah, I mean, were they a dominant team? No, but when you put them on the field, they found ways to win games and certainly took down the great Miami team. The number of NFL guys that were on the field that day, if I just read the starting lineup, you would say, yeah, he played 10 years in the league. He played 10 years in the league on both sides. I mean, you have guys like Sean Taylor for Miami, the late Sean Taylor. You have, Dorsey kind of banged around the league a little bit. Willis McGahee was in the league for a while, obviously. Andre Johnson, I believe that was his name, the wide receiver. He was amazing. For
Kellen Winslow.
Yeah, Kellen Winslow Jr. had an okay NFL career, at least for a few years before some things kind of crept up on him. But, really the offensive and defensive lines, again, for Miami were amazing on both sides. And what can you say? I think Wilfork may have been on that team as well. So, yeah, guys that played for years and years and years and years in the NFL.
Absolutely. We could go on all night,
We could.
Steve.
We could. 25 years of doing this. I've got it all stored up here.
I know you do. I know you
I
do.
may be a little off on a factor or figure, or what I'm finding out is that I have committed to memory the scores from games when I first started doing this full time in 95, 96. But if you asked me what the score of a game was that was just played last year, I couldn't remember. I have to look it up.
So,
because
Steve, we're in the same bucket when it comes to that. I'm exactly the same way. I remember every score from the late 70s on through the 80s,
the first time
and the
through.
90s.
Yeah.
Yep, I remember all those scores. But last year's, I remember the Rose Bowl score and the Big Ten championship game score.
Yeah.
But if they were playing a MAC school, I don't remember those games anymore.
Yeah,
And they start
it's
to run
hard.
together.
It's hard to. I think the hard drive in my brain is starting to fritz out a little bit. Thankfully, we have the internet, and all that stuff is right at our fingertips whenever we want it anymore. With all the different websites out there that have archived all the stuff. But yeah, it's been, as I say, a remarkable quarter century of Ohio State football, and I think that this could be another exceptional year. They were 13-1 last year. Can they improve on that and take that next step and get back in the playoff? You say put it all on Fields, but really their defense has to play better, and I think it's going to be an exciting year.
Good stuff. Always a great discussion with Steve Hellwagon. Please join him and the rest of the staff there at 247 Sports Bucknuts, where Steve is a senior Big Ten writer. And of course, here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. If you're coming across what we do here on a regular basis, please check out the videos and hopefully you'll choose to subscribe. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by. It's always a great discussion.
All right. Take care, Mark.